producer of our show, John Mantley, called me up one morning. He says, well, have you seen the Hollywood Reporter? And I said, no. And he said, well, get one and read it on page 1. And anyway, it was just a little box thing at the bottom saying Gunsmoke is canceled.
Many people who love classic television know Gunsmoke as one of the longest-running and most successful shows ever. But not everyone knows the surprising story behind its sudden end. For 20 years, it dominated screens and drew millions of loyal viewers every week. The cast believed the journey would continue, just like always. Then, without warning, it disappeared. No final episode, no proper goodbye. So, what really happened behind the scenes, and why did those closest to the show feel deeply betrayed by its quiet cancellation? The shocking cancellation of Gunsmoke. By the early 1970s, Gunsmoke had grown far beyond being just another television show. It had become something much bigger, almost a permanent part of American culture. For years, it had weathered change after change. The format had evolved, actors had come and gone, and audience tastes had shifted in new directions. Yet, through it all, the show endured. But surviving for so long did not mean it was safe. Behind the scenes, the television industry itself was changing in ways that Gunsmoke was never built to keep up with. One of the most common reasons people give for the show's cancellation is falling ratings. And yes, there is some truth to that. By the early 1970s, Westerns were no longer as popular as they once were. The cultural mood was shifting. Younger viewers were becoming more interested in modern stories, sitcoms and dramas set in cities, dealing with real-world issues like politics, generational conflict, and changing family life. These shows felt more immediate and relatable. Advertisers, always chasing younger audiences, naturally followed that trend. But that explanation doesn't tell the whole story. Gunsmoke was not failing. In fact, it was still doing quite well compared to many other shows on television. Its ratings were steady, and it had a loyal fan base that had followed it for years. The real problem wasn't that it had collapsed. It was that it no longer fit the network's new priorities. At the time, CBS had begun to rethink what success meant. It was no longer just about how many people were watching, but who was watching. Younger, urban viewers were seen as more valuable than older, rural audiences. This shift changed everything. When CBS moved Gunsmoke to a different time slot to make room for All in the Family, it wasn't just a simple scheduling decision, it was a turning point. The move disrupted the habits of longtime viewers, and as expected, the ratings dropped. But instead of giving the show time to recover, the network treated that drop as proof that Gunsmoke had run its course. This decision was part of a much larger strategy. Around that time, CBS began clearing out shows that were associated with rural settings, older audiences, or traditional storytelling styles. Even programs that had been successful for years were suddenly labeled outdated. The goal was to reshape the network's image, focusing on modern urban stories that reflected the changing world. In that environment, Gunsmoke, with its slow pacing, moral complexity, and frontier setting, no longer seemed to belong. What made the cancellation especially upsetting was how abruptly it happened. The cast, including James Arness, reportedly had no warning. Many of them believed there would at least be one final season or a proper goodbye episode. Instead, the show simply ended. After 20 seasons, there was no grand finale, no emotional farewell, just silence. For fans, this felt deeply disappointing. People had spent decades following life in Dodge City, growing attached to its characters and stories. They expected some kind of closure, a final moment to say goodbye. Instead, Gunsmoke disappeared almost overnight. Viewers responded with anger and frustration, sending letters to CBS and accusing the network of treating a television landmark as if it didn't matter. The rise of Gunsmoke. When people talk about the greatest television westerns ever created, one name almost always rises to the top: Gunsmoke. But this show wasn't just popular, it reshaped what television drama could be. At a time when many series played it safe, Gunsmoke chose a different path. It was serious, thoughtful, and often uncomfortably honest. Instead of turning violence into spectacle, it showed the consequences. The story of Gunsmoke began in 1952, when it first aired on CBS Radio. It was created by Norman Macdonnell and written by John Meston. At that time, most radio westerns were loud, simple, and aimed at children. Gunsmoke did the exact opposite. It was quiet, serious, and often dark. The stories focused less on gunfights and more on their aftermath, how violence affected towns, families, and the people responsible for keeping order. The main character, Marshal Matt Dillon, stood at the center of it all. On radio, he was voiced by William Conrad, whose deep, commanding voice gave the character a sense of weight and realism. Dillon wasn't the typical fearless hero riding in to save the day. He was thoughtful, sometimes weary, and often unsure whether the law he enforced truly solved anything. This grounded, morally complex approach made Gunsmoke stand out immediately. When CBS decided to bring the show to television, it kept that same tone. The TV version premiered in September 1955, and from the very beginning, it felt different from everything else on screen. Casting James Arness as Matt Dillon proved to be a defining choice. Tall and physically imposing, yet emotionally restrained, Arness brought a quiet authority to the role. He remained with the series for its entire run, from 1955 to 1975, becoming one of the most recognizable faces in American television. The supporting cast added depth and balance. Dennis Weaver played Chester Good, Dillon's deputy, not as a fearless sidekick, but as a kind and sometimes uncertain man trying to do his best. He stayed on the show until 1964. Milburn Stone portrayed Doc Adams, the town doctor, blending dry humor with wisdom and moral clarity. Amanda Blake played Miss Kitty Russell, a saloon owner written as a sharp, capable businesswoman who understood people better than most. Her relationship with Dillon was subtle and never reduced to cliches. As the years passed, the cast evolved. Ken Curtis joined as Festus Hagen, bringing a rougher, more down-to-earth personality that matched the changing tastes of the 1960s. And for a short but important period, from 1962 to 1965, Burt Reynolds appeared as Quint Asper, years before he became a major Hollywood star. Audiences responded in a big way. By the late 1950s, Gunsmoke wasn't just successful, it was dominant. From 1957 to 1961, it ranked as the #1 show in America. Even as television grew more competitive, it remained a constant presence in prime time. For 13 seasons, it stayed among the top 10 most-watched programs, an achievement very few shows have matched. The format of the series also changed over time. It began with 30-minute episodes, which allowed for tight, focused storytelling. But in 1961, the show expanded to 1 hour, giving writers more room to explore deeper character development, longer storylines, and more complex situations that didn't always end neatly. By the time it finally ended, Gunsmoke had aired 635 episodes across 20 seasons. For many years, it held the record as the longest-running scripted primetime series in American history, a title it kept until The Simpsons eventually surpassed it. The show earned 15 Primetime Emmy nominations and won 5. But its true legacy was its influence. Later westerns, like Bonanza, drew heavily from the mature, character-driven style that Gunsmoke helped establish. It proved that westerns, and television dramas in general, could be intelligent, emotional, and deeply human. By the early 1970s, Gunsmoke was still going strong. Ratings remained solid, the audience was loyal, and the cast understood their roles better than anyone. On the surface, everything seemed stable. But behind the scenes, things were changing. Network priorities were shifting. Creative tensions were quietly building. Decisions were being made far away from Dodge City. Decisions that would soon bring one of television's greatest shows to an abrupt and unexpected end. Was there a rift among? Why was there pressure on the cast and crew? Let's find out. Tensions behind Gunsmoke cast. By the early 1960s, Gunsmoke looked almost impossible to shake. To viewers at home, everything seemed solid and dependable. The ratings were still high, the stories were familiar, and the characters felt like old friends welcomed into their living rooms each week. It gave the impression of a show that could go on forever without changing. But behind the cameras, the reality was more complicated. After nearly a decade on air, the long years of steady work were beginning to wear on the cast and crew. The pressure didn't explode all at once. Instead, it built slowly. Quiet tensions, small frustrations, and personal differences that became harder to ignore over time. One of the most talked-about relationships on set was between James Arness and Dennis Weaver. On screen, their characters, Marshal Matt Dillon and his loyal deputy Chester Good, worked together with ease. Their partnership felt natural, built on trust and understanding. Viewers saw them as a perfect team. Off-screen, however, things were less simple. Reports from those who were there described the two men as polite and professional, but not especially close. Arness tended to keep to himself. He was quiet, private, and not very social during filming. Weaver, on the other hand, was more expressive and driven. He had growing ambitions and a restless energy that pushed him to want more from his career. As the years passed, that difference became more important. Chester had become one of the most recognizable characters on the show, but the role had clear limits. He was loyal and sometimes awkward, often playing second to Dillon rather than leading stories himself. As Gunsmoke evolved into longer, darker, hour-long episodes, there were fewer chances for Weaver to explore new sides of his character. There was no clear record of open conflict between the two actors, but the distance between them reflected something deeper. Weaver wanted to grow, to take on bigger challenges, and the show could no longer give him that. By 1964, after spending nearly 10 years on Gunsmoke, he decided to leave. His exit was not sudden or dramatic. At the time, it was explained in a simple and reasonable way. He didn't want to be permanently known only as Chester Good, and he wanted to explore new acting opportunities. That decision turned out to be the right one. Weaver quickly found success in other roles, especially in McCloud, proving he had made the right move for his future. Still, his departure marked an important moment. It was the first clear sign that even a hugely successful show could quietly limit the people working inside it. About a decade later, another major departure carried even more emotional weight. Amanda Blake, who played Miss Kitty Russell, left the series in 1974 after 19 seasons. She had been part of Gunsmoke almost from the very beginning, and her character had grown along with the show. Miss Kitty was no longer just a saloon owner. She had become a central figure in Dodge City, someone who understood its struggles, its dangers, and its people. She added emotional depth to the story, and her presence helped hold the world of the show together. By the time Blake decided to leave, many factors were coming together. Nearly 2 decades of long filming schedules had taken a toll. The routine of repeating similar story patterns year after year became exhausting. The pressure to stay consistent in such a long-running series weighed heavily on the cast, many of whom had built their entire lives around the show. There were also quiet reports of creative disagreements, especially about how her character was being used in later seasons, though nothing was ever officially confirmed. On top of that, Blake was dealing with serious health problems, which made the demanding pace of television production even harder to manage. When she finally stepped away, it was presented as a personal choice, not a dramatic fallout. But her absence was felt immediately. For viewers, Miss Kitty had always been there. For the production team, her departure was another reminder that the original heart of Gunsmoke was slowly changing. Years earlier, another cast member had faced a similar situation, but in a different way. Burt Reynolds joined the show in the early 1960s as Quint Asper, the town's blacksmith. At that time, Reynolds was still a young actor trying to build his career. The role gave him visibility, but it also came with limits. Quint was a supporting character in a show already centered around established leads. Episodes were tightly packed, and there was little room for new characters to grow. As Reynolds gained confidence, he began to feel frustrated. He wanted more screen time, more variety in his roles, and a chance to take the lead. But Gunsmoke was not designed to offer that. Its structure was already set, and its focus remained on its main characters. In 1965, Reynolds made a bold decision. He left the safety of a steady role to take a risk on his future. Like Weaver, he chose uncertainty in hopes of something bigger. And like Weaver, that gamble paid off. Within a few years, he was on his way to becoming one of the biggest film stars of the 1970s. None of these departures happened because Gunsmoke was failing. In fact, the show was still strong. But long-lasting success can create its own kind of pressure. The show needed stability, but the people working on it needed change and growth. As Gunsmoke moved further into its later years, these quiet internal struggles continued to build, and eventually they would meet even bigger challenges coming from outside the show, setting the stage for a dramatic final chapter. So, what challenges did they encounter? Did they overcome it? Let's find out. The hidden struggles behind Gunsmoke. By the early 1970s, Gunsmoke was no longer just a television show made for storytelling. It had grown into a huge and complicated production machine, one that required careful planning, large budgets, and constant attention from the network. After nearly 20 years on air, it had become one of the most expensive programs produced by CBS. The reasons for those rising costs were easy to understand. The show depended on large, permanent sets built to look exactly like Dodge City, with streets, buildings, and interiors that had to be maintained over time. It also relied heavily on outdoor filming, which brought its own challenges. Crews had to travel, equipment had to be moved, and filming schedules had to work around unpredictable weather. On top of that, scenes shot in different locations had to match perfectly, which required careful coordination. Then there was the cast. Gunsmoke had a big group of actors, and many of them had been part of the show for years. Their salaries had grown along with the show's success, and rightly so. None of these expenses were unnecessary, but together they created a very costly operation. In earlier years, that wasn't a problem. The show consistently brought in strong ratings and was a key part of the network's schedule. It was dependable, and that made it valuable. But by the 1970s, the business side of television was starting to change. Advertisers began to look beyond simple viewing numbers. It was no longer enough for millions of people to watch a show. What mattered more was who those viewers were. Networks wanted younger audiences, people who were seen as more likely to spend money and respond to commercials. While Gunsmoke still attracted a large audience, many of its viewers were older, and that made network executives increasingly uneasy. These concerns soon started to affect decisions behind the scenes. In 1975, CBS moved Gunsmoke to a different time slot. For a show that had built its success on consistency, this change caused real disruption. Loyal viewers who were used to watching at a certain time didn't always follow the show to its new slot, and ratings began to slip. From the point of view of the producers, the decision felt sudden and unnecessary. But for the network, it was part of a bigger plan to reshape its programming. This revealed a growing divide. The people making Gunsmoke wanted to preserve its quality and stability, while the executives were focused on changing the network's overall image. Around this time, began a major shift that would later be known as the rural purge. This was a deliberate move away from shows set in rural areas or the past, and toward stories based in modern cities. The goal was not to fix failing shows, but to redefine what television looked like. New programs reflected this change. Shows like All in the Family focused on current issues, social tensions, and everyday urban life. They were bold, sometimes controversial, and designed to get people talking. Compared to this new direction, even a respected and long-running series like Gunsmoke started to seem old-fashioned in the eyes of executives. Inside the network, the message was becoming clear. Being on the air for a long time was no longer a strength. In fact, it could now be seen as a weakness. This put the Gunsmoke team in a difficult position. They were expected to continue producing a complex and expensive show, even as the network around them was moving in a completely different direction. The show was still performing well by traditional standards, but those standards were losing importance. What made the situation even more frustrating was that the show wasn't declining because of poor quality, controversy, or failure. Instead, it was being affected by changing priorities at the executive level, decisions that had little to do with the world of Dodge City or the people who had spent years building it. As these pressures grew, the cast felt the uncertainty too. Many of the actors had built their careers around Gunsmoke, and now they were facing an unclear future. Some would go on to find success elsewhere, while others struggled to move beyond the roles that had defined them for so long. For viewers, the end of Gunsmoke was more than just the cancellation of a television show. It marked the closing of a long and familiar chapter. But for the people behind it, it was the beginning of a complicated and often difficult new phase. So, how did it end for Gunsmoke actors? Were they satisfied? Let's find out. Gunsmoke's quiet farewell. For the actors who became most closely linked to Gunsmoke, the end of the show did not feel like a neat, satisfying goodbye. Instead, it felt more like quietly walking away from a place that had been their home for many years. They had lived inside that world for so long that leaving it behind was not simple. Fame had given them steady work and financial security, but it also came with hidden emotional costs, burdens that stayed with many of them long after filming ended. At the center of it all was James Arness, the man who brought Marshal Matt Dillon to life for 2 decades. On screen, he looked strong, calm, and completely in control, a figure people trusted without question. But away from the cameras, his reality was very different. He was naturally shy and often struggled with self-doubt, especially in the early years of his career. Acting did not come easily to him in social situations, and he never truly felt comfortable being a celebrity. His personal challenges did not begin in Hollywood. Before becoming an actor, Arness served in World War II, where he was seriously wounded in combat. That injury caused him constant leg pain for the rest of his life. Even while working on Gunsmoke, which often required physically demanding scenes, he quietly carried that pain without drawing attention to it. Viewers never saw that struggle, but it shaped his daily life and helped explain why he preferred to stay out of the spotlight. As he became one of the most recognizable faces in America, Arness chose to live differently from many other stars. He avoided Hollywood parties, rarely gave interviews, and spent as much time as possible away from Los Angeles when he was not filming. To him, fame was simply part of the job, not something to celebrate or chase. The most heartbreaking moment of his life came in 1975, the same year Gunsmoke ended. His daughter, Jenny Lee Arness, passed away after facing serious mental health struggles and personal difficulties. The loss deeply affected him. Friends later said he became even more private and withdrawn after her death. In the years that followed, he only appeared on screen occasionally, choosing his roles carefully and never trying to match the massive scale of Gunsmoke again. When he passed away in 2011 at the age of 88, people remembered not just his fame, but the quiet strength with which he carried his personal hardships. Dennis Weaver, who played Chester Good, took a very different path after leaving the show. For years, he had worried about being forever tied to that one role. So in 1964, he made the bold decision to step away from Gunsmoke and reinvent himself. That choice paid off. He later starred in the television series McCloud, where he played a confident and modern lawman, a sharp contrast to the nervous, limping deputy he had portrayed before. The role proved that he could succeed beyond his original character and gave him a new sense of confidence. Outside of acting, Weaver became deeply committed to environmental causes. He used his fame to speak about conservation and sustainable living, turning his public platform into a tool for change. This new chapter allowed him to step out of Gunsmoke's shadow in a way that few actors from long-running shows ever manage. He continued working for many years and remained passionate about the issues he believed in until his health declined. He passed away in 2006 at the age of 81 after battling cancer, remembered both for his acting and for his activism. Amanda Blake, who played Miss Kitty, chose yet another direction. After leaving Gunsmoke in 1974, she largely stepped away from acting altogether. She had always loved animals, and in her later years, she focused her energy on that passion. She helped establish the Arizona Animal Welfare League, dedicating her time and resources to protecting and rescuing animals. Her life after the show was much quieter, far removed from the television industry that had made her famous. Although she occasionally appeared at fan events, she showed little interest in returning to acting full-time. Sadly, her later years were affected by serious health problems. In 1989, she passed away at the age of 60 due to complications related to acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. At the time, misunderstanding and stigma surrounding the disease were widespread, and this often overshadowed discussions of her achievements. So, what does it take to be in the spotlight on Gunsmoke? Or is it just like every other medium? Let's take a closer look. Cost of fame on Gunsmoke. Another key part of Gunsmoke was Milburn Stone, who played Doc Galen Adams. His character gave the show a strong emotional center. Doc wasn't just the town doctor. He was a steady, thoughtful voice, someone who kept things grounded. He often questioned Matt Dillon, but he did it calmly and wisely, never needing to raise his voice. Stone brought a sense of warmth and quiet strength to the role, making Doc feel just as important as any lead character. Behind the scenes, though, Stone faced serious health problems in his later years on the show. In the early 1970s, he had a heart attack, which forced the production team to adjust filming schedules and storylines while he recovered. For a while, he appeared less often, and the long, tiring shooting days became harder for him. Still, unlike some younger actors who left to explore new opportunities, Stone stayed as long as he could. He remained loyal to the show and valued the stability it gave him. When Gunsmoke ended in 1975, he stepped away from acting completely. After spending decades in the industry and 20 years as Doc Adams, he chose a quiet life. He passed away in 1980 at the age of 75, remembered by fans as one of the kindest and most dependable figures on the show. Ken Curtis had a very different experience. Before joining Gunsmoke, he had already built a career as a singer, especially with the Sons of the Pioneers. Moving from music into acting wasn't easy, and joining a long-running, successful show made things even more challenging. When Curtis replaced Dennis Weaver as Festus Hagen, he stepped into a role that audiences would naturally compare to the previous one. Festus was rougher, louder, and more openly emotional than Chester, and Curtis fully embraced those traits. Over time, the character became popular in his own way. Still, Curtis could never escape the fact that the show mainly revolved around Matt Dillon. Being part of such a strong cast meant he had little control over the story or how much screen time he got, which reportedly frustrated him at times. After Gunsmoke ended, Curtis continued acting in westerns and TV films, often staying within the same genre. He also returned to his musical roots, performing again with the Sons of the Pioneers. This mix of acting and music defined his later years. He passed away in 1991 at the age of 74, leaving behind a career closely tied to the Western stories that helped shape American television. Perhaps the most dramatic journey after Gunsmoke belonged to Burt Reynolds. Frustrated by limited screen time as Quint Asper, he chose to leave the show in 1965, a risky decision at the time. For a few years, success didn't come easily. But by the 1970s and early 1980s, Reynolds had become one of Hollywood's biggest stars, leading major box office hits and redefining what a leading man looked like for a new generation. However, his success came with challenges. At the height of his career, Reynolds struggled with financial problems, costly divorces, and growing health issues. Injuries from doing his own stunts, along with later medical complications, slowly began to affect him. As time passed and public attention shifted, the industry that once celebrated him began to move on. In later interviews, Reynolds spoke openly about his regrets and difficulties, often reflecting on how his early decisions, including leaving Gunsmoke, shaped both his successes and his struggles. He passed away in 2018 at the age of 82, remembered as both a charismatic superstar and a reminder of how unpredictable fame can be. For all of these actors, Gunsmoke was both a blessing and a limitation. It gave them stability, recognition, and a lasting legacy. But it also shaped how the public saw them in ways that were hard to change. As time went on, their lives took very different paths, influenced by personal challenges, changing goals, and the realities of growing older in an industry that rarely slows down. By the mid-1970s, many of the people who had built Gunsmoke were tired, aging, or already gone. The show was still running, but its core had changed. And while many viewers assume it ended because it lost quality or popularity, the truth is quite different. The real reason had much more to do with decisions made far above the actors and crew. But in reality, Gunsmoke wasn't canceled because it failed. It was canceled for a far more surprising reason. Find out. So, what do you think about the sudden cancellation of Gunsmoke? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe.